more of the genealogy from Matthew chapter 1. We talked last time about David, Israel's second king. Uh, his story is panoramic. And I mean, I did a fairly inadequate job of cracking it open last time. And the, so here's how the rest of his story basically went. David, if you've been in church for a little while, I bet you've heard a lot about David and his story. The darkest time in his life in terms of his motives was when he sent Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, a warrior and one of David's mighty men, into battle in an intentional way so that he would be killed. And then he brought Bathsheba into his household, and she was already pregnant, of course. She gave birth to a baby boy whose name was Solomon, and that's the next part of the genealogy. David, this is in verse 6, was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. This was not, excuse me. It's not like David or Matthew was saying, oh, and by the way, David knocked her up. But he didn't leave out the fact that Bathsheba had been Uriah's wife. Now here's something to consider in this. This was not a book written to Gentiles. This was a biography written for Jews. And let me tell you, Jews knew David's story. Today, not very many students in junior high, high school, or even elementary know very much about George Washington, because educators have fairly successfully, actually quite successfully, eliminated him and the study of his life from the curriculum. They just know, oh yeah, old dead guy. Well, that was not the case with Israel. Israelites knew David's story. He was among the heroes of Jewish faith. And so when they heard or read, oh yeah, she had been Uriah's wife, they knew exactly. Well, one of the aspects of David's life that I think is equally, well, no, maybe that's not fair, because how do you measure the weight and value of one sin against another? But his sin with Bathsheba had consequences. And just to carry David's story a little farther forward, one of his close associates was prophet Nathaniel, who confronted him about this sin. And David finally, don't know how fully, I think pretty fully, but he finally confessed it. Now, it was not just a matter of, oh yeah, I probably should have told somebody that I knocked her up. Sorry for using these clinical terms, but I think he repented. At any rate, he became Solomon's father. This was not his only child. He had concubines, he had many children, and he also apparently neglected his parenting obligations. His kids were a mess. One of his sons, Absalom, who was, by the indication of the narrative, one of the most handsome and charismatic figures in all of Israel. Well, that son attempted to murder his father so he could take the throne. It was an ugly story, and the whole constellation of David's family and children was just a dumpster fire. Out of that still came Solomon. Solomon became Israel's king after David. And you know about Solomon. He was considered and was recognized as the wisest man in the world in his day. He studied virtually every branch of literature, history, science. He was a poet. He wrote most of the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes. Books full of wisdom. As a matter of fact, I often offer a challenge to use the book of Proverbs for a daily quiet time book. There are 31 chapters in Proverbs, and lots of months have 31 days in them. So you can read whatever chapter corresponds with the date on the calendar and get all the way through the book in a month, and it wouldn't take you more than 10, 15 minutes to thoughtfully read through one chapter at a time. It's loaded with God's wisdom, godly wisdom, and so valuable for our contemporary lives. It took me a long time to appreciate Ecclesiastes, though. When I was a kid, Proverbs, I'm reading it and going, wow, okay. Not so with Ecclesiastes. I thought, man, this is a depressed old guy. And then I became an old guy and realized, this book makes tons and tons of sense. So if you're over 50, I'm going to suggest and recommend and challenge you to read the book of Ecclesiastes slowly and thoughtfully and see what you think. Okay. But Solomon had, excuse me, a trainload of wisdom. And he expressed early on the wisdom that was his in an encounter with God. God came to him in a dream and said, ask me for what you want. This is after he became the king. And Solomon said, all I want is the wisdom to rule these people well and lead them well. God said, granted. And because you haven't asked for riches, wealth, fame, I'll give you these too. Sure enough, it happened. But he had this Achilles heel. Either for the purposes of political alliance or just because he liked women, he wound up with a harem of concubines and hundreds of wives. Was, in our culture, it would have been disgraceful. It was his wives that drew him away from his faith in God and his practices of observing God's law. So that by the time he died, he had alienated himself from God's design and God's blessing. Well, he then gave his status as king to his son Rehoboam. And you know how I said David's family, his children, were a mess? Solomon was no better. No better at being a real father and parenting and discipling his kids. At least not with Rehoboam. Rehoboam becomes king, and the story is sad, in my opinion. He decides, I'm gonna run this country how I want to. So he calls together his father's counselors and says, so how could I best gain the support of the people? And they were quick to say, lower the taxes, take your foot off the accelerator. That will cause them to have great loyalty towards you. See, Solomon, he had at the time of his the peak of his reign as a king of Israel, had amassed incredible wealth. Probably he was the most wealthy king in the world at that time. But he did this at the expense of the Israelites. He had taxed them and highly, but he did build the temple. He had a magnificent palace. He had built roads and had built stronghold cities as protection. But the people were languishing because the tax rate was so high. Well, Rehoboam said, okay. Then he called in counselors his age, and they said, are you kidding? Lay it on them. Tell them, my dad, he whipped you with a whip. I'm going to whip you with serpents. You think it was bad under him? Listen, I'm the baddest man in the land. Don't get crosswise with me. And so that was the advice he took. And he essentially, what he did is he split the kingdom. From his point on, Israel became a divided kingdom, and that's what it's called in theological language, the divided kingdom, Israel and Judah. Israel lost its status in the world because of that split. Jesus said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And the history of Israel illustrates that. Well, I'm going to stop with Rehoboam today and pick it up next time. And trust me, from here through the rest of the genealogy, there's not quite so much story material. And I'll do my best to not take so many bunny trails, but I'll pick it up next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.